So it really gives me great pleasure now to introduce to the podium Steph and Jane, who will speak about their experiences and their perspectives about methamphetamine use. So, and if you would thank Paul again as he walks off the stage there as Steph comes up. Thank you, Paul.
Before I discuss the work that I do and my perspective on methamphetamine or ice use in Victoria, I want to stress 2 points. One, that the current hysteria surrounding ice is counterproductive. Whether you agree with anything else I have to say, please remember that reverting to knee-jerk, panicked reactions merely compound the harm experienced by individuals who use this drug and breaks down the communication channels that could lead to the development of effective, practical solutions. My second point is that very little attention is actually being given to the majority of people who use ice. Due to this climate of hysteria, we seem to focus predominantly on the beginning and the end, that is uptake and treatment. We forget that the majority of people who use this drug are doing a good job of hiding it, and they're leading productive lives. Sure, the sword of Damocles may be hanging over their head, but until that if-when moment that the sword drops, people who use ice are generally having much better sex than the average person, and they're being more productive at work too. Fear-mongering demand reduction campaigns, like Not Even Once, do little to impact whether or not someone starts using a drug, but tailored, peer-led harm reduction education can decrease the likelihood that someone's pattern of use becomes problematic and increases access to treatment referrals if things start to go wrong for a person. I coordinate Harm Reduction Victoria's drug outreach program called DanceWise. Of our 2,300 interventions last year, less than 10% related to ice at all. From our perspective, there's no sign of an epidemic, but admittedly, acute stimulant overdoses can be dramatic and resource draining. DanceWise attends music events and festivals across Victoria. We interact, for want of a better term, with recreational drug users. At events, we work closely with an events medical team who refer intoxicated attendees who are medically fine to our service. The DanceWise Chill Out Space is hosted by peer educators who undergo senior first aid training, mental health first aid, a range of other training modules including needle and syringe program outreach, bloodborne virus and STI education, basic pharmacology, CASA's responding to sexual assault workshop, and an unaccredited but highly effective training developed by a Californian-based multidisciplinary association of psychedelic studies to deal with challenging psychedelic experiences known as trip sitting. As an aside, the principles of trip sitting are also anecdotally quite effective for managing stimulant overdoses too. Most critically, DanceWise peer educators are recruited from the scene and have a wealth of personal experience that informs their work. And I argue that this personal experience makes them less likely to stigmatize and discriminate other people who use drugs. The harm that flows from stigma and discrimination is real and significant. Stigma and discrimination can be perpetuated quite subtly, and even the most compassionate healthcare setting workers are too frequently guilty of making concerned or even sympathetic comments that reveal their ignorance regarding the life experiences of people who use drugs and create an additional barrier between their clients and essential health services. But I'm less concerned about concerned healthcare setting workers saying inconsiderate things than, for example, police having inadequate training to respond sensitively to stimulant overdoses. I'm concerned that emergency departments are under-resourced and have to put overstimulated people in behavioural observation rooms, aka the last place on earth you would want to try de-escalate a stimulant overdose, or they're relying too heavily on sedation. I'm concerned about the lack of cooperation, understanding and mutual respect between emergency services and community services. I'm concerned about callous media portrayals, and facetiously, I worry that the government is so keen to be perceived as having fixed the problem, they may even consider offshore ice treatment centres. Because living with your head in the sand is easier than engaging in challenging conversations and developing sophisticated, nuanced solutions to complex problems. Within the DanceWise Chill Out space, we aim to empower people through information sharing so people can make informed choices. We do not tolerate discrimination on the basis of race, age, gender, sexual orientation, or drug use. And lateral violence between people who use drugs is an issue too. People who use GHB and ice and people who inject any drug tend to experience higher levels of discrimination. Our Chill Out space is a place where people can recover from any distress they've experienced due to intoxication or visit for health and sexual health resources. And most importantly, it's a space where information about safer drug use that is empirically based, substance-specific harm reduction education can be shared. The information exchange is a two-way street. One of DanceWise's greatest achievements in recent years is the publication of a series of substance-specific harm reduction educational resources, which includes our publication on ICE. These resources are disseminated during brief interventions that provide insight into what our peers want, need, and know, which in turn informs how we edit and refine our resources. In each double-sided A4 sheet, we don't waste words trying to discourage uptake or promote cessation of use. If we did that, we'd lose our credibility and sever the unique and productive link we have with our community. What do we say? We define the chemical compound, provide dosage tips, encourage people to record their pattern of use according to a unit of measure that suits them best. We catalogue the short and long-term physical, emotional, and psychological effects of the substance, its duration, and note the minimum amount of time needed between last dose and driving a vehicle. We discuss the effect of polydrug combinations, with particular emphasis on common combinations like GHB and ice. We stress how important it is for people who use ice to eat nutritious food regularly, even though the impact of the drug makes one not feel like eating or crave starchy food. Drink water regularly. We're used to saying this to people who drink alcohol, and this message is even more important for people using stimulants who are more susceptible to dehydration. We remind people that proper hydration is so important for well-being generally, but mental health and memory specifically. And then there's the importance of sleep. Sleep deprivation and problematic ice use are so closely linked, and since having detailed conversations about sleep patterns is less confrontational than asking someone when they last had a cracky, as a suggestion, interventions could primarily focus on returning a person to healthy sleep habits, and this may inadvertently address their ice use. During brief interventions, we discourage people from using alone. In the same way that dosage diaries, sleep, food, and water intake diaries are tools that individuals can utilize in order to keep their use in check, using in private but in front of others encourages regulated use. I'm not simply saying use together, but disclose and display your use to a trusted person who is going to accept you warts and all. And this is the crux of the issue. Not everyone has a network of supports, and further, not many people have supports who are willing to tolerate their use. Where does that leave a lot of people who use ice? The sword that hangs above their head is double-edged. You're ostracized out of fear that disclosure will lead to monumental rejection, but isolation means your drug use is more high risk and you're more likely to experience monumental harm. Jane.
Okay, so HRV have been funded by Department of Health for over a decade to deliver overdose education to current drug users. At a time when Melbourne was experiencing a heroin glut and the number of overdoses was on par with the road toll, the HOPE, which was Heroin Overdose Project, was born. It was overdose prevention, focusing on what causes an overdose, recognition, knowing at what point it becomes a medical emergency, and finally overdose response, knowing how to respond to that overdose. There's many different definitions of the term overdose, so to make things simple, we work with the definition of overdose as when you've had more drugs than what your body can safely handle. In order to keep up with changing drug use trends and the growing popularity of polydrug use, in 2002 the project broadened its aim to include all types of drugs and took on its current name as the DOPE Project, Drug Overdose Peer Education. The media began to run its usual alarmist headlines depicting ice as a new scourge of society, and any story that included any violent behaviour, they found a way to name ice use as the reason. Mentions of ice methamphetamine and methylamphetamine in Australian print media can be measured, and our media records show that these terms were mentioned 6 times in 1999. By 2003 it rose to 53 times, and in 2007 it was mentioned a total of 1,033 occasions. We began by trying to debunk some of those blatant lies and hysteria created by the media, such as heroin users had responded to the heroin drought by switching to ice. Whilst that's true for some people, perhaps someone on a pharmacotherapy with a tendency to use whatever drugs available, for the majority, ice is no substitute for heroin. And it was surprising how many people who were using ice thought that you couldn't overdose on it. As Sass has already mentioned, we don't focus on preventing uptake. People are going to do what they want anyway, or stopping use. After all, we work with people who are already using drugs, and we'd rather direct our effort toward making sure people are doing it the safest way possible. Of course, when appropriate, we'll refer people to relevant services such as detox, but let's be honest, if we're talking about treatment, there isn't any. There's no methadone equivalent, and we know that the period of time needed for detox is longer than what current services are offering. So in actual fact, what we have to offer people is simply a respite or time out from their drug use. With regard to drug use, harm reduction works. It's a policy that in theory has our government backing, and it certainly has better results than zero tolerance approaches such as just say no. But we also can see harm reduction is not such a neat fit when we're talking about ice, mainly because it's such a toxic drug and there are nasty side effects. This is evident by the presentations at emergency, which are often very noticeable and labour intensive for those involved. Ending up in a starkly lit, bland, white observation room against your will and after being forcefully sedated is a traumatic outcome. It's thankfully reserved for a small minority of people who use ice. The psychotic outbursts are usually displayed by those with a tendency to a pre-existing mental condition that's been exacerbated by not so much the drug itself, but more so the behaviour whilst under the influence, lack of sleep, food and water. Take drugs out of the picture, deprive a healthy person of these basic necessities, and you'll see similar behaviours. Denying a person food, water and sleep is being used as a form of torture, and it's easy to see why. So rather than waiting until a person reaches these extremes, our education includes strategies such as preparing your body before a binge. If you're planning to be up all night, prepare yourself by having a good sleep. Starting off with a full tank of gas, i.e. food in your belly and well rested, is a better starting point than running on empty. To many of you, this might seem like simple common sense messages, but to someone under the influence of a drug which we know acts upon your dopamine receptors and actively suppresses your appetite, they can be really helpful and timely reminders. We know scare tactic campaigns do little to deter drug use and in some cases can work in reverse by actually increasing uptake. The stigma and discrimination experienced by people who use ice is a direct result of these types of misinformed campaigns, and if anything, they make the situation worse. Our government has banned the sale of ice pipes, and now we've got a situation where people who have traditionally been against injecting drugs are now considering it as a route of administration. So in closing, I'd just like to reiterate some of the points Sass made, being that the current hysteria surrounding ice is counterproductive, and in anything, it makes it harder for an individual to seek any sort of help. And very little attention is given to the majority of people who use ice without any ill consequences. It's all too easy to forget about those people. They're using it, they're doing a good job of keeping it hidden, and I mean really, why out yourself when you know what the response is going to be?
Thanks so much, Steph and Jane, for that. It's crucially important to get a really good, clear understanding of actually what is happening amongst people who are using methamphetamine and ice. So thank you. And I'd invite everybody to be able to chat with Steph and Jane during the breaks if they're able to. So